A gute Woche and a freilichen Chanukah. Before we go into today's Farbrengen, this week was Yutes Kislev, and the Rebbe spoke. Yutes Kislev was Monday. The Rebbe spoke Sunday night, very briefly, after Ma'ariv, after he came back from Doyle, as well as Monday night, also after Ma'ariv, the Rebbe spoke. The Rebbe urged in both of these times that make Yutes Kislev Farbrengens. In fact, the Rebbe started off Sunday night with a traditional wish which is suitable for Yutes Kislev. L'shana Tova, being that Yutes Kislev is Rosh Hashanah l'chsidos, so the Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe expressed the wish for L'shana Tova, b'darkei hachsidus, b'limud hachsidus, Shana Tova and the learning of Chassidus, b'darkei hachsidus and the drachim of Chassidus, and the paths of Chassidus. The Rebbe Sunday night referred to the Hayom Yom. He repeated something which is mentioned in the Hayom Yom, which is the Sefer which the Rebbe wrote with a little short vote for every day. The Rebbe referred to it as Sefer, a small Sefer, Sefer. The Rebbe said that this Sefer was reviewed by the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe reviewed it thoroughly. The Rebbe said that Sefer is written for an Ibeya. I think it was Tafshin Gimel. That's the first year when the Rebbe published it, 1943. That year was also an Ibeya, Shana Tmima, so it's suitable to this year as well. To make use of it. The Rebbe said that if we will look into it, we will realize the shaykhs that every vote has to the day that that vote is put for. And Monday night again, the Rebbe urged very strongly to Farbrengen Yutes Kislev, and he said to make Sturmdike Farbrengens. The Rebbe expressed himself really. There's a question arising. The Rebbe was talking after Ma'ariv. The Rebbe says, what's everybody doing here to davening? Everybody should have been busy in the middle of a Farbrengen, in the middle of a Chassidische Farbrengen, a Yutes Kislev Farbrengen. He said it with a smile. But he says, famous expression, Af ha-meise fragt man nicht kein Kasche. Na meise, you don't ask no questions. So the same, again, the Rebbe brought out that it is 190 years since the Yutes Kislev is being celebrated. 190 has a very strong shaykhus to Yutes Kislev. The Bechlal is brought to Chassidus that the shleimus, the completeness of every number, is in Eser, in 10. Tens. And Yutes Kislev is Yutes is 19. So now when we're saying it's 190 years since we have Yutes Kislev, so it's the shleimus of Yutes Kislev, the shleimus of number 19 is brought out in 190 when it's multiplied by 10. So therefore this is a Yutes Kislev of very special significance. In fact, it was both nights the Rebbe gave dollars, and each of them the Rebbe gave $3 to everyone. Express himself. First of all, we know that Yutes Kislev has to do with Pada B'Sholem Nafshi. The Gemara says regarding Pada B'Sholem, Kol ha'isik b'Torah, Kol ha'isik b'milas chesed, u'mispalel matzibur, and learns Torah. Kodesh Baruch Hu says, Ma'ala ani Allah, he's crediting him as he has Poda'ani, as he has oizgeloist, he has bailed out the Rabbeinu Shalom mibein ha'umos. So therefore, number 3 has a special significance to Yutes Kislev, because Yutes Kislev has a shaykhus with Pada B'Sholem. And Pada B'Sholem, the Gemara dashes on Pada B'Sholem, that this pasuk has a shaykhus to each of the 3 kavim, Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim. Especially also, Yutes Kislev, the first year, 190 years ago, when the Rebbe came out of, was released from prison, then Yutes Kislev came out on a Tuesday. So it's again an union of Gimel, a Yom Shehukful by Kitayv. The Rebbe stressed that how we see by Chassidim, there's a minhag Chassidim have that they Farbrengen Yutes Kislev in the afternoon, the latter part of the day, and it's extended into Chav. That's the minhag of Chassidim. Perhaps this is the minhag originated because when the Alter Rebbe came out of prison, we all know that the Alter Rebbe asked to be brought to a house of a chassid. Famous story, but in that same building where the chassid lived, also a misnagid lived. And Seems like by error, the Alter Rebbe was taken into the home of the Misnagid, who, as it's described in the Sichos, did not treat the Alter Rebbe properly at all. On the contrary, he made it very, I use the expression, miserable for the Alter Rebbe to the extent, and the Alter Rebbe spent a couple of hours in the house of the Misnagid, and the Chassidim didn't even know where to locate the Alter Rebbe. They knew that the Alter Rebbe was released, and the Chassidim in Peterburg, and that today's Leningrad, began a search to find the Alter Rebbe, until in the house of the Chassid, which was in the same building, they heard a lot of noises in the upstairs apartment. Seems like because he was raising questions to the Alter Rebbe, and he was in a very disrespectful way, asking him all types of questions. Until finally Chassidim found out what happened, and they went out and got the Alter Rebbe out of the home of the Misnagid. So perhaps the Rebbe referred to this story, so that means that the real Geula was not till Yutas Kislev real late in the day. So that's why perhaps based on that is the Chassidish minig, that minig of Chassidim, that Yutas Kislev, the Farbrengens, the Chassidish Farbrengens of Yutas Kislev are always extended into Chav Kislev. In fact, the Rebbe expressed himself that Chassidim had a minig that they would begin Farbrengen Yutas Kislev, and they would extend the Farbrengens from Yutas Kislev into Chanukah. It was an interesting expression. The Rebbe was talking about alerting to Farbrengen Yutas Kislev. He kept on using the expression Sturm dicke Farbrengen, stormy Farbrengens. He expressed himself that it's appropriate what a Farbrengen does, that one says L'chaim to another, and Nishes Reyehu Yazoiru, it leads to help from one to another. And there he said that also at these Farbrengens to say L'chaim, and to say L'chaim, and also have in mind those people who are physically not there, but are tied b'machshava, in thought they are tied to these Farbrengen. I mean, everybody speaks, obviously the Rebbe was simply referring to himself, who this year did not Farbrengen Yutas Kislev, kind of like the Rebbe asked, that when Chassidim will say L'chaim, they should also have him in mind and say L'chaim to him, though he's physically not taking part in the Farbrengen. Thursday night, when the Rebbe came back from the Yoel, the Rebbe also spoke a Sikha. And a Thursday night Sikha, the Rebbe expressed himself that kind of this is like the last opportunity which we have to talk before Hanukkah to remind everybody to prepare properly for Hanukkah. Of course, Erev Hanukkah this year is Shabbos. On Shabbos we cannot do any preparations for Hanukkah. And there is even Muktzah. So therefore the Rebbe again utilized this opportunity to alert everybody to bring the message of Hanukkah to everywhere possible. The Rebbe says that we should make use of our acquaintance and of our friends and everybody who we think that is not aware of Hanukkah, to make sure that we involve them as well to fulfill the mitzvahs of Hanukkah. The Rebbe mentioned we should not forget the people that are in the hospitals, that we should reach out to them as well. The Rebbe spoke about the importance of the Yiddish minig of giving Hanukkah geld, the great significance it has to children. The Rebbe mentioned that it's also appropriate to train the children that when the children are receiving their Hanukkah geld, this is money which they are earning, and therefore the children should know that they should give tzedakah from that. Now we will go into a little bit of today's Farbrengen. Today, the Rebbe began the Farbrengen this afternoon, because we've been talking about V'hachayit in Eliboy, which is the Rebbe's expression for a Hayrah which we can derive from an Inyan in Torah. The Hayrah which we take out of an Inyan is called V'hachayit in Eliboy. Those live are taking it to their hearts, giving it to their hearts, the Hayrah, L'payil, which we can take out of specific Inyanim in Torah. Especially we find in the Mamarim of the Alter Rebbe in Torah, which is the Rebbe refers to Torah, that is the Chassidische Parsha, the Chassidische Sedre, where the Alter Rebbe explains the whole Inyan of Vayeshev Yaakov Bever Shava, and explains how it has a shaykhs to the Klal, to Yidden as a group, and also the shaykhs it has to the Prat, to each and every individual of Klal Yisrael. Especially today, we discuss about refer to in Yonim not only the way the Kfiyas is according to the days of the month, but also to the way the Kfiyas is the days of the week together with the days of the month. Therefore, this year is a special year that Erev Chanukah comes out to be on the Shabbos. Erev Chanukah comes out, Chavdalit Kislev, which is Erev Chanukah, comes out to be on the Shabbos. Now there's a machlekes of Poskim, of Rishonim. When did the war stop? See, Chanukah really has two inyanim. There were two major factors in Chanukah. There is the Netzach and HaMelchama, the defeat of the war, the victory which we had in the war, as we bring out in Va'al Nisim, Masalta Geburim, Biyat Chaloshim, Rabbim, Biyat Miatim, Tmeim, Biyat Tahirim, Shon, Biyat Tzadikim. All this stresses the great success which we had in overcoming the Yevanim and overcoming the Greeks in the war. That's one inyan in Chanukah. Another inyan in Chanukah is the fact that the Pach HaShemen was found, the little jar of oil which was found, which Yidden did not have any pure oil to light the menorah with, and the Rebbe made a nest that this jar of oil was found. And going a step further in the nest is not only that the oil was found at a measurement of oil which would normally be sufficient only for one lighting of the menorah, and here the Rebbe made a nest that it lasted not only for one day, but it lasted for 8 days. And the Alter Rebbe brings out, the Alter Rebbe goes according to the Shitta, the Rebbe continues, that Chavdalet Kislev, which is Erev Chanukah, was the Netzach and HaMelchama. In other words, the victory in the war was on Chavdalet Kislev. And the finding of the Pach HaShemen, that was on the next day on Chavhei Kislev when we really start off with Chanukah. And the Alter Rebbe brings out, why must we learn that way? Because this concept of Niguf LeMitzrayim, V'ripu LiYisrael, this we find by Yitzias Mitzrayim. We find that the Rebbe plagued the Mitzrim and cured the Yidden, and it happened all in one day. This, the Alter Rebbe explains, is something which can only happen in a Yontif which is Mid'eraisa, which is Minat Torah. Mididrei Seifrim, we don't have enough strength to absorb such a great Gilui in one day. We cannot absorb such a revelation in one day. Therefore, it had to be divided in 2 days. That on Chav Daled was the Netzach of the Mulchama, and Chav Hei was, and Chav Hei Kislev was the nest with the Pachshem. Here the Rebbe mentions also that most poskim hold that there is no chiyuv, there is no obligation of simcha on Chanukah. Why? Because when we celebrate Chanukah, Simcha is something which has to do with a Gashmi Yizdike, with a Gashmi Yizdike Netzach, and with a Gashmi Yizdike victory. Being that Chanukah we celebrate for the fact that we found a little bottle of oil, and this bottle of oil lasted for 8 days and burned for 8 days, though it only had the shear of 1 day, the quantity of 1 day. This is not a Gashmi Yizdike Yontif which should bring out the chiyuv of simcha. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe mentioned that the Rambam is under the opinion that there is a chiyuv of simcha even on Chanukah as well. But most poskim are under the impression that Chanukah, there is no chiyuv of simcha on the yontiv of Chanukah. Furthermore, there are those poskim that even learn that the finding of the oil was able to take place on the Chav Dalet. Side the victory, side the Netzachim of the Mulchama, as well as the finding of the oil, this also could have happened on Chav Dalet. The only thing, what happened on Chav Hei when we begin to celebrate Chanukah, what happened on Chav Hei was the nest that not only they poured into the menorah a quantity of oil which normally would last 1 day, and this quantity lasted, instead of for 1 day, it lasted for 8 days. Now, in regular years, though, when does the celebration of Chanukah begin? We begin on Chav Hei, but nonetheless, in a year when Erev Chanukah does not come out on Shabbos, and when is the menorah lit in Shul? The menorah is lit in Shul in the afternoon of the 24th. So this is already how the 24th day of Kislev has a shaykhs to the Yontif of Chanukah. This year, that the 24th of Kislev comes out to be on Shabbos, so when do we light the menorah, even in Beis HaKnesses, even in public places? It is also not late until tonight, which is already Chafei. But nonetheless, being that it's Shabbos, and Shabbos we know, Uv'yom Simchaschem, there's a pasuk in the Torah of Yom Simchaschem, your days of Simcha, and the Sifri interprets that what does it mean by days of Simcha? It means the days Elu HaShabbos. So Mamela, we also have the fact that there's an union of Simcha on this Shabbos, and especially considering that this Shabbos is the day of, which is from this Shabbos we're already straight entering into Chanukah. And here the Rebbe brought out how we find in Shabbos, on one side we say that Shabbos it has to be Kol Malachtecha Asuyah. We have to feel on Shabbos that as if everything, all our malacha, as if everything is done. We're not allowed to do anything, and not only that, we have to build within ourselves an attitude, Kilu Kol Malachtecha Asuyah, as if everything is done. On the other hand, we know that would it not be for the effort of the person, that the person has prepared before Shabbos, then he wouldn't have what to eat on Shabbos. Famous expression of Chazal, Misha Torach be'erev Shabbos, Yochel b'Shabbos. The one who prepares before Shabbos, he's the one that can have to eat on Shabbos. Same thing I was bringing out in the Mulchama. The Mulchama on one hand, who is the one that's behind the Mulchama? Behind the Mulchama is the Rebishter. And the success of the Mulchama is the Rebishter. On the other hand, the Nitzach HaMulchama, the victory of the war, to the extent that it's called Melachtecha, the credit of it, like is given to Yid. But again, Yidden are successful in the victory of the war, but however, who is behind their success? Behind their success is the Rebishter. When we're talking about the Indian of a victory of a war, and being successful in that, being that we're now coming from Yitas Kislev, and Yitas Kislev has a shaykhus to Pada B'Shalom, so this leads us into the concept of Pada B'Shalom Nafshi. By the way, when we're talking earlier in the Sikha from the Rebbe spoke Monday night, the Rebbe brought out that this year is 190 years from the first Yitas Kislev. Now, in the Sikha, which there's always a Sikha which the Rebbe speaks on Shabbos, the main points which the Rebbe speaks on Shabbos is always published during the week, and there's what we call a Mugedik Sikha. It's edited, it's reviewed by the Rebbe. The Rebbe reviews what is put together. One week it comes out in Yiddish, and another week it comes out in Lashon HaKodesh. This is how the system goes. So in last week's Sikha, already based on what the Rebbe spoke on Monday, where the Rebbe is stressing the fact that it's 190 years from Yitas Kislev, so there's also an addition in the footnotes that 190 is Begematria Kates. Kates means, by Yidden Jewish vocabulary, the concept of a Kates is a set year for Geula, for Mashiach. Kates means an end. In other words, an end of Galus, a set year for Mashiach to come, that's called a Kates. Mela, it's something of special significance, but this year is Kates years from the coming of Mashiach, as we'll soon hear later. It's a Kates years from Yitas Kislev, so therefore it's again an appropriate year for Geula. So again, regarding Pada B'Shalom, so this kapitel was said by David HaMelech. David HaMelech said, Pada B'Shalom Nafshi, that the Rebishter has redeemed his nefesh, his soul, has redeemed him in peace. In other words, what's the pshat? He's redeemed him in peace. But even though David had enemies, people of Avshalom, so the Anshe Avshalom, the people who were until now enemies to David, they as well also made up with David. That's the stress, Pada B'Shalom Nafshi. Not only was he saved, Pada Nafshi, but the P'diyah was, the redemption was B'Shalom, with peace. In other words, that the one who until now was his enemy, now is no longer an enemy. And as the pasuk goes on, mikrovli, what means a krov? Krov means a battle. In other words, from the battle which he had with his enemies, the Rebbe still led that it should be pada b'sholem nafshi. So there's a maimer from the Mittler Rebbe, which begins pada b'sholem nafshi, which this maimer the Rebbe referred to in last week's Farbrengen, and as well as in the Farbrengen of 2 weeks ago Shabbos, the Shabbos of Yud Kislev, where the Mittler Rebbe brings out that there are various levels in pada b'sholem nafshi. There is the level which we just discussed, the first madrege, which refers to David HaMelech, and we say by David HaMelech it was pada b'sholem nafshi. In other words, kind of a peace which was made between him and his enemies. However, there is a higher madrege in pada b'sholem, and that is the peace which prevailed in the next generation, the generation of Shlomo HaMelech. What's the type of Shlomo? So we know Chassidus always brings out Shlomo Shmoi, his name was Shlomo, V'sholom haya b'yamo, and in his time, in his days, there was peace. What meant us? Shlomo was not involved with enemies. Not the type that he had enemies, and he had to make peace with his enemies, and straighten out things with his enemies. We're talking about a higher madrege. The madrege of Shlomo was a complete madrege of Sholom. Mittler Rebbe continues, when will we have the Amitis Inyan HaSholom, the real Inyan of Sholom? That will be when Mashiach will come. When Mashiach will come, the entire world, in the entire world will prevail the concept of Sholom, as we say in the famous Haftarah, the Goz, the Avim, Keves, sheep and wolves will be able to live together. What is all this stress? That will be the highest level of Sholom, will be when Mashiach will come. Talking here about the Inyan of David and Shlomo, both of them having a shaykhus, to pada b'sholem. Rabbi says that in the Rambam it's mentioned that Mashiach will be a descendant of David and Shlomo. The question arises, why does the Rambam have to say David and Shlomo? Could have said one of them. We want to say because of the fact that David had many sons. That's why the Rambam wants to say that who Mashiach be a descendant of Shlomo, in other words, a descendant of David, but David via Shlomo. So the question arises, Shlomo also had many sons. And nonetheless, the Rambam is not getting involved to mention of whom of Shlomo's children will Mashiach be a descendant. Is that siman? So we must say that there's a stress of David and Shlomo. This, that we referred to, he spoke about it at length also last week. We know that David made all the preparations to build the Beis HaMikdash. Nonetheless, David was not the one that built it. Why? As the Rebbe himself told him, Dam Rav Shafachta, you have shed too much blood. All with perfect intentions, all with milchamas and battles which were to protect Klal Yisrael. But nonetheless, he was not the one to build the Beis HaMikdash. Ki im Shlomo b'neich, the Rebbe is telling David that his son Shlomo, he will be the one that will build the Beis HaMikdash. On the other hand, we find that when Shlomo built the Beis HaMikdash, and he was about to enter the Beis HaMikdash, at the dedication of the Beis HaMikdash, the gates of the Beis HaMikdash did not open until David's name was mentioned. And when David's name was mentioned, that is when the gates opened. So what do we see? That in order for the Beis HaMikdash to be constructed and to function, and the gates of the Beis HaMikdash should open, there was a need for the involvement, Sai of David and Sai of Shlomo. In other words, it's not David himself, and it's not Shlomo himself. The same, when the Rambam is talking about Mashiach being a descendant of David, Ushloime, so it's taka accurate. The kavanah is, the intention of the Rambam is that there is the inyan of David as well as the inyan of Shloime, which are contributing, both are equal contributors to the fact that Mashiach will be a descendant of them. Reb is concluding where he began, is first of all that we have to realize that the victory of the Milchama, so talking back to Chanukah, is the Pada B'Shalom Nafshi, that it was through HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Especially when we're talking on a Shabbos. Shabbos in itself has a shaykhus to Shalom, to peace. As we know, in many communities there's an expression, Shabbos Shalom. And not only that, we know what we say as soon as we come home from davening Friday night and we come into the house and we begin the Shabbos Tish. What are the first words we say? We say Shalom Aleichem, Malachei HaShalom. So again, stresses how the concept of Shalom has a shaykhus to Shabbos. But we continued. We are in a time, Shabbos. Shabbos is a time, as we mentioned earlier, Kol Melachtecha Asuya. It's a time when all our work is done. Especially we are in this year. This is the year of Tafshim Memtes. Tafshim Memtes, the Rebbe keeps on stressing, is a year of Tashmeit Yodecha. What the Tashmeit? That is as if all our debts are already paid. Memela, if all our debts are paid, we don't have any obligations. So therefore, what's the pshat to choyves? Mipnei chatoenu kolinu me'artzeinu. What led to golus? Being that we sinned. So in other words, if our debts are all paid, then there's no longer any reason why we should stay in golus. The reason we are in golus is because we haven't met our obligations. But if it's a year of Tashmeit Yedecha, we've already met all our obligations. We don't owe any chayvus, we don't owe any debts. We have paid up everything. We have satisfied all our debts. The mail is appropriate time. The Rebbe concludes to demand from the Rebishter Ad Mosai, how much longer are we in Golas? V'sachzena inenu b'shuvcha l'tziyah, that the Rebishter should take us out of Golas. And Torah itself instructs us that this is the wish of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Rebishter wants. We should demand from him that we should no longer be in Golas, and that we want to come out of Golas. We'll again stress that we are in the afternoon, which from this afternoon we are entering Chanukah, which is again a specialty of this afternoon. And we know that there's the machlokes of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai are under the opinion. Beis Shammai are under the opinion that we start lighting 8 days, and we light in a reduced fashion from 8 to 7 to 6. So definitely, the first day includes all the 8 days of Chanukah. Because if we're lighting 8 in the first, according to Beis Shammai, definitely includes all of the 8 days. But even according to Beis Hillel, that Beis Hillel was under the opinion, and this is Taka the Halacha, Beis Hillel was under the opinion that we start lighting 1, and from 1 we go up and increase more and more. Nonetheless, still the first night, being that the first night we recite 3 brachas, as opposed to all other nights when we do not say the Shechayanu. So the Shechayanu, which we say the first night, this has a shaykhus to the entire week. Memela, this again stresses how the first night of Chanukah, this is the key to the entire Yontif of Chanukah. And here the Rebbe is going back to what he began the Sikha with the interpretation which we find in Torah and the Chassidische Parsha on Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz megurei aviv. Where there the Alter Rebbe explains what's the taich Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz megurei aviv. So the Alter Rebbe taich is megurei is meloshen oiger, somebody that assembles. To assemble, to collect, is called oiger in Hebrew. What's the pshat? Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz megurei aviv. Yaakov collected, Yaakov assembled all of the nitzutzos, kedusha, which were left from his father, from Yitzchak. And furthermore, megurei also indicates on the word yira, fear. And we all know that the difference between Avram and Yitzchak was Avram served the Rebishter from an approach of Ava, from an approach of Chesed. However, Yitzchak's Avodas Hashem was channeled through Gvura, through Pachad Yitzchak.
So therefore, here Yaakov is being involved in a continuation of the Avodah of Yitzchak. Vayeshev Yaakov. Yaakov has settled. What is Yaakov doing? Megurei Oviv. He's collecting, he's assembling all the sparks of Kedusha. And again, Megurei Meloshin Yira, which, being that it has a shaykhs to Oviv, it has a shaykhs to his father Yitzchak. Yitzchak's derech and serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mainly through fear, through pachad. So Yaakov is here concluding the avodah of his father. Yeshiv Yaakov be'eretz megurei Oviv, and the pasuk continues be'eretz Canaan. What's the pshat Canaan? Canaan, besides meaning the country of Canaan, mischa, business, in Aramaic is called Canaan. Canaan, there's a pasuk, Chassidus always quotes a pasuk, Canaan biyodoi moiznei mirmo. So therefore, what's the pshat? What shaykhs does it have here? Because just like we know, Chassidus explains at length, that when a person is involved in his inyanim of mischa and his inyanim of business, and it is dafke there where the sparks of Kedusha have traveled, and one is successful in elevating the sparks of Kedusha out of Gashmias, the same way Yaakov is doing it the same way. Be'eretz Megurei Oviv, he's Maila, he's collecting gold in Tzutzis Kedusha. Be'eretz Canaan, through Gashmias, through Mischar, through business, through dealings, and when dealing properly and accordingly, and the Yid does it the right way as it's supposed to be, that is when he's successful in elevating the sparks of Kedusha that have traveled and have been waiting to be elevated from the Gashmis where they are hidden, and he has the koyach to elevate them. Same the Rebbe is saying, this is corresponding to the concept of Chanukah. What's the whole union of Chanukah? Chanukah is also, we light the Chanukah candles al Pesach Beis Mibachutz, on the door which is going towards the outside. And as the Gemara uses the expression, until what time can we light Chanukah candles? The Gemara says, Adekalya Rigla de Tormadoi. Simple meaning of it is, Gemara raises the question, until what time can Chanukah candles be lit? Gemara answers that there were certain people, they were called Tormadoi. And these Tormadoi were like late walkers in the street. They would go to the streets late. So Gemara says that as long as these people are walking in the street, we can still light Chanukah candles. There's still Persume Nisa, in other words. The Nes is still being publicized. So here the Rebbe is mentioning, in other words, the whole union of Chanukah is to affect even the Talmudoi to reach out. I didn't mention it, but Chassidus always brings this in. Talmud is the same oisius, as the same letters as Moired, rebel. In other words, the whole idea of Chanukah is to reach out even to the one who is considered the one who is rebelling in Yiddishkeit. What's the whole meaning of Chanukah? To bring light, Lichtigkeit of Chanukah. The Lichtigkeit of Torah, the Ne'er Mitzvah of Torah, which this is the message of Chanukah, to bring it to even such a Jew as well. And here the Rebbe, in a very indirect way, when he's mentioning the Talmud, Talmudoi, now these Talmudoi, as mentioned, these are a tribe of people who walk in the streets late. The Rebbe finds a way to remind us that he says the Talmudoi still remain Talmudoim. In other words, they are not Yidden. Why? Because as long as one does not go through Giyah Kahalacha, it's not, Giyah can only be, conversion can only be Kahalacha. If it's not Kahalacha, then it's worthless and it has no meaning. So the Rebbe says, not like those that are making mistakes and think that Giyah could be not according to halacha, and being now we're talking about Vayeshev. Vayeshev, as Rashi stresses, is an indication on hisyashvus, on a pleasant relaxation. The Rebbe says even those that have been making an error till now and not realizing that Giyah can only be in according to halacha, hopefully they too will realize this, and they will realize it in a hisyashvus-like way. In other words, in a way, in a peaceful and a relaxed way, they too will understand that Giyah conversion is something which can only be in accordance to halacha. Here the Rebbe is concluding the inyan of Vayeshev. What does Rashi tell us on Vayeshev? Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. Yaakov wanted to relax in peace. And what was the end? That this request of Yaakov, ultimately later it was taka fulfilled. Because when Yaakov came down to Mitzrayim, which were his last years, 17 years Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim, Toiv, is equivalent to 17, which right away tells us that the best years of Yaakov's life, years of Shalom, V'shalva, peaceful years, this is what Yaakov had when he lived in Mitzrayim. But concluded that being now we are at the end of day of Shabbos, we are entering into, from Parshas Vayeshev, we are going into the Parsha of Miketz. Miketz means the end. So it's again a time to stress that it should be the end of Golus. The Rebbe uses the expression Daloi Golus, and everything. In other words, we should go out of Golus, and enough have we been in Golus, and it's time to ask from the Rebbe Ad Mosai, and let us fulfill and observe Chanukah already with Mashiach. When Mashiach will come, we will also be observing Chanukah. Here the Rebbe reminded that Chanukah is also Meloshen Chinuch, Meloshen education. It's a proper time in Chanukah, an opportune time it's a reminder on education, aside for people, the education of children, as well as education. One should educate ourselves properly. Especially that this year has been proclaimed as a year of Shnas Hayelad V'Hayalda, a year to make sure that every Jewish boy and girl receives a proper Jewish education. So it's extremely appropriate to tie this in with Chanukah, because Chanukah is also a reminder on Chinuch, Chanukah, Meloshen Chinuch, Meloshen education. The Rebbe continued referring to a Rashi, and it's the custom that the Rebbe refers to the first Rashi in the Sedra. First Rashi in the Sedra is Vayeshev Yaakov. And Rashi gives a lengthy explanation that how we find the system, how the Torah is relating the generations, how Rashi explains that after the end of the previous Sedra, the Torah has told us about Esav and his children. Now we're going to discuss about Yaakov and his children. But Yaakov and his children, the Torah discusses at length, because this is something which is very dear and significant by the Rebbe. And here Rashi gets into a lengthy explanation. The same thing we find by the 10 generations that have been from Adam until Noach. So also the Torah relates about it very briefly. However, when the Torah comes to Noach, that is when the Torah tells us at length about Noach. The same when we have 10 generations from Noach until Avraham. So also the Torah relates about these 10 generations in a very brief way. But when it comes to Avraham, this is where the Torah tells at length all about Avraham. And Rashi explains it with a mashal, with a parable of the precious pearl which fell into sand, and they've took a sift, right? Thank you. A sift to sift through the sand so that they should be able to locate the pearl. The same way, Noach and Avram, and now here Yaakov and his children, that's considered something precious. However, all the other generations in between are not so significant, so therefore the Torah does not relate to them in fullest detail. This is what Rashi tells us, the first Rashi of this Sedra. The Rebbe kept on stressing here in the Sikha, what is the Vahacha Yiten and Liba which we can derive from this whole thing? And what is really the difference between Noach, Avram, and Yaakov? Noach, when the Torah begins to tell us about Noach, the Torah talks about Noach, B'tchilas Avedosai, the beginning of the Aved of Noach. Noach started out, Olam Chodesh Ra, he saw a new world. After the Mabul, even before the Mabul, right away the Torah begins to relate detail about Noach. Then it comes to Avram. Also, Torah begins right away at the beginning of Avram. Here, when we're talking in Parshas Vayeshev, Rashi does not say this earlier when we're talking about the birth of Yaakov. Rashi is saying this here when Yaakov is not a youngster anymore. On the contrary, here Yaakov was already successful in putting up 12 Shvatim, 12 tribes. So Yaakov here is at a level of mitose shleima. This is the expression regarding Yaakov. His bed is complete. That means that all the descendants of Yaakov were all perfect. So regarding Noach, we find Rashi tells us right away at the beginning of Parshas Noach, there are those that relate to Noach in a positive way, and there are those that relate to Noach in a gnai, in a shameful way. That Taich, that Dafke, in his generation he was a tzaddik. Had he lived in the later generation, he wouldn't be a tzaddik. Then when we're talking about Avram weiter again, Avram had a problem with Yishmael. Avram had, as the expression goes, Yotza mimenu Yishmael. Yishmael was still a descendant of his. Like the main shaykhs to Avram is Yitzchak. Yitzchak yikor la Chazarah. Yitzchak is called the child of Yaakov, of Avram. However, there was still the Yotza mimenu of Yishmael. Not only that, Avram had some sort of a sympathy to Yishmael. And it was Sarah who had to convince Avram, Sarah that had to convince Avram that it's not proper to hold Yishmael at home. He will have a bad influence on Yitzchak, and therefore to send away Hagar and Yishmael. What do we find? What did the Rebishter tell Avraham Avinu? The Rebishter told Avraham Avinu, Koila asher toima elecha Sarah, shma bekoila. Listen to whatever Sarah will tell you. In other words, Avraham was not convinced to do what Sarah told him. The only way he did listen to Sarah was what we would call with a Kabbalah soil, because the Rebishter told him, listen to what Sarah tells you. Furthermore, Avraham, we see, Avraham, his inyan was chesed, and mitzad chesed, he saw a room, he saw a way to try and work with Yishmael as well, and that is why he begged from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lu Yishmael Yichye Lefanecha. And we find when the Orchim came, when the guest came to Avram, when Avram was right after the bris, and the Rebbe sent him Malachim, and Avram thought they were human beings, and Avram took the Nar to help him. Who does Rashi tell us does it mean the Nar? Avram involved Yishmael. Furthermore, when Avram took Yitzchak to the Akedah, he took the two Na'arim. Who was one of them? It was Eliezer and Yishmael. So again, we see that Avram had some sort of a softness within him, where had it be only up to him, he would not send away Yishmael. He would maintain Yishmael and Hagar at home. Though, definitely the Rebbe says, Sarah was an Isha Kshera that Oyser Etzoy Baila. Gemara tells us that Isha Kshera, kosher woman that does the wish of her husband. And when she realized the wish of her husband is to keep Yishmael at home and not to send Yishmael and Hagar away, she was aware that this was the wish of Avraham. Nonetheless, she went and she insisted that Yishmael should not stay home. So again, in other words, the Rebbe is bringing out how by Avraham there was something lacking. What was lacking by Avraham? By Avraham, Yishmael had to leave. Yishmael yotze mimen. The same thing we find weiter by Yitzchak Vayeshev, Yaakov Vayeshev, the children of Yitzchak. So again, by Yitzchak it was not mitose shleimot, it was not a complete satisfied with all his descendants, because there was an Esav. However, who was successful in putting up mitose shleima? That was by Yaakov. By Yaakov, it was all his children were in perfect shape. Here, talking on this inyan, the Rebbe mentioned a few, indirectly the Rebbe mentioned that there's a halacha, mitzvah lefarsim oisem mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to publicize those people who do mitzvahs. The Rebbe says, one could say, he wants to be a hatzna leches, he wants to do things quietly. We say, no, that's not what Torah requests. Torah requests to publicize when one does a mitzvah. Just like in the negative, we know that we punish somebody. And the pasuk uses the expression "Laman yishmu v'yeho." This person was punished so that others should see and not follow, not do what he has done, will refrain from doing what this person has done. The same way, in the positive way, there's a concept of mitzvah l'falsa ma'aseh mitzvah. When somebody does a mitzvah, it's a mitzvah to be a mefalsa. Memela, by Noach also did a lot of gewaldige things. Noach was involved in stock, and Noach did a lot of acts of charity. The mere fact, when he had everybody in the teva, Taka the Rebbe told him to, but he followed the instruction of Hashem. And he was involved in providing the needs for everybody. And same thing by Avraham Avinu, as we just discussed at length, to what extent Avraham's chesed was. However, where was the real concept of hachai yiten el libo? In other words, what should a yid really wish himself? That what should be by every yid? It should be like it was by Yaakov. In other words, being that Yaakov was successful in putting up mitosei shleima, that all his children were perfect, this should be the real desire of every yid, to be like it was by Yaakov. Even regarding Ruvain, there's a discussion in Gemara whether Ruvain is considered Ruvain chata, Ruvain sinned, or he didn't sin. So one opinion in Gemara says that kol ha'imeh Ruvain chata, anyone that says that Ruvain sinned ein elo toyeh, it's an error. Even according to those that claim that he did sin, but nonetheless he did tshuva. So tshuva is vital something positive. So the Rebbe is bringing out that the v'achai yiten el libo, the v'achai yiten el libo, which every yid should want to follow, should be to follow Yaakov. Yaakov, in other words, is a living example for every yid, especially as it's brought out of Chassidus, how every neshama has a shaykhus to Yaakov. Until what happens is, Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz megurei Aviv, that Yaakov becomes the balabos on the entire world, and all of this is done in a way of his yashvus. And here the Rebbe came back to another inyan which he discussed last week also, and referred to it today again. Last week the Rebbe asked a question. Last week or 2 weeks ago, Yaakov was sent by his parents to do a shidduch. To get married. Thank you. To get married into the house of Lavan. So the Rebbe asked, why did Yaakov detain himself, or where did Yaakov get permission to detain himself, and spend 14 years in the house of Shem ve'eva? And even when he finally arrived to Lavan, after spending 14 years in the house of Shem ve'eva, and Lavan told him that he will have to work 7 years until he will get married, Yaakov agreed to that. Yaakov knew that his parents were so eager he should get married. So first of all, why did he detain himself 14 years in the house of Shem ve'eva? Secondly, when he arrived to Lavan, and Lavan told him that he should work 7 years until he will give him one of his daughters, he could have told Lavan and explained him that he wants to fulfill the wish of his parents, and therefore he will work after he will give him his daughter, and let him get married before. Today the Rebbe also referred to this shaila again, and brought in, we find in Gemara regarding Ben Azai, regarding Ben Azai, who was a Tana. Gemara says that he never got married. Why? Because nafshe choshka b'Torah. He had a desire to learn Torah, so he never got married. Either is a mitzvah of getting married and putting up a family. So regarding Ben Azai, there's even another opinion that he got married and he later divorced. Again, because nafshe choshka b'Torah. He had a very strong desire to learn Torah. In Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Alter Rebbe, in the halachas of Talmud Torah, where he discusses this inyan, the Alter Rebbe says that a person can postpone his wedding because of learning Torah, but then the person has to make sure that he will not have a Yetzer Hara, and will be able to overcome his Yetzer Hara, have control of himself. So the Rebbe is saying regarding Yaakov, here we find that Yaakov had a lot of fear. Yaakov was in pachad. Yaakov was in fear because he was afraid. Shema nislach leich bechet. Perhaps he got dirty spiritually. Bechet with sin. Memela. So Yaakov, who was afraid that he sinned, in other words, the Rebbe is strengthening the question. Yaakov, who was afraid that he sinned, how was it that he delayed his wedding for so many years? Rebbe concluded here the inyan. That's what he's mentioned last week regarding the mitzvah of Prul Vu, mitzvah of having children, maintaining the world, Shabbos Yitzhara. So there's a famous vote from the Alter Rebbe that what is the first mitzvah in the Torah? The first mitzvah in the Torah is Prul Vu. The Alter Rebbe teaches, what does it mean? It means as ein Yid darf machen noch a Yid. The obligation that every Yid should see to it to make another Jew spiritually. Besides the simple meaning of the mitzvah, it means our obligation to care for another Jew. As the Rebbe expressed himself today also, ein Yid soll machen noch a Yid, und ein Chosid soll machen noch a Chosid. One Chosid should see to it to make another Chosid. The Rebbe concluded the Farbrengen, being that we are still within the days from Yitzhak Kislev, and Yitzhak Kislev is the day when we wish L'shana Tova, and the learning of Chassidus, and the drachim, and the acts, and the paths of Chassidus, and being that a few days from Yitzhak Kislev have already passed, so therefore we are definitely involved in vananda packen the peklach. This is the expression which we use regarding Tishrei, regarding what Rosh Hashanah. That after Rosh Hashanah and after Tishrei we open the packages which we have received. So the Rebbe is applying the same expression here to Yitzhak Kislev. In other words, it's an expression that tremendous keiches are being given, tremendous amount of strength is being given. And now what we have to do is we have to open these packages and bring them down into action and put them into effect for the entire year. And here the Rebbe mentioned that we are entering Chanukah, and the Rebbe is mentioning the opinion of the Rambam. The Rambam is in the opinion that Chanukah there is also an obligation of Simcha, so therefore we should utilize Chanukah properly. It should be Freiliche Chanukah and so forth. A gute Woche and a Freiliche Chanukah.